from theheart.org, Medscape Cardiology. This is the Bob Harrington Show. Dr. Robert Harrington is the Arthur L. Professor and Chair of Medicine at Stanford University. This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals only. Any views expressed are the presenter's own and do not necessarily reflect the views of WebMD or Medscape.
Hi, this is Bob Harrington from Stanford University here on theheart.org and Medscape Cardiology. As we often try to do, in addition to covering what I'll call the latest science in the field of cardiovascular medicine, we try to touch upon topics which are really hot ones in our community, trying to bring awareness to conversations that are happening in society, conversations that are happening within the specialty, conversations which are happening amongst colleagues. And this particular week, what I'd like to do is to really talk about maybe one of the most important issues in medicine today, issues of how structural racism leads to some of the social determinants of health and results in worse health outcomes, including amongst individuals with cardiovascular disease for certain racial groups. So for example, we know that Black men, for example, have much worse outcomes from cardiovascular disease than white men. And so these are the kind of topics that I want to get into with our guest today. I have been looking forward to meeting this guest for a while since I started reading her pieces. My guest today is a Harvard medical student. It is LaShyra Nolen. LaShyra also goes by Lash, and so after this intro, I will be referring to her as Lash. She is a rising fourth-year Harvard medical student. She is also beginning her studies for a master's degree in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, as if she didn't have enough to do with medical school. Importantly, she is the first Black female class president at Harvard Medical School. And something I didn't know, but many of you who are Harvard Medical School grads or who trained in the Boston programs will know this, the Harvard Medical School class president serves through the duration of that class's time at Harvard. So she's had great sense of oversight of her class and great understanding of the medical education process. As way of background, she was born and raised in Southern California. She went to Loyola Marymount University, where she received her undergraduate degree, and then went to Spain as a Fulbright scholar. While there in Spain, she focused her research on issues around obesity and diabetes, certainly in keeping with the metabolic issues in cardiovascular medicine and cardiovascular prevention. But she also spent time leading conversations and teaching Spanish teenagers and young adults on topics related to health inequities, disparities, and racism. So with that as a background, I'm really excited to introduce our Medscape audience today on Medscape Cardiology to Lash Nolen. Lash, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and I know it's going to be very rich.
Well, I appreciate taking the time with all you're doing. I suspect you have less time than I do. So thank you for jumping into this. Lash, I read a couple of pieces that you have written in the last 18 months or so. One was in New England Journal talking about what's missing in medical education. The other in the Huffington Post, dealing with what I found a fascinating way of framing a question. What's the answer that you really want to give when a professor that often looks like me as a white older man asks you, how are you doing today? And so I'm going to try to frame some of my conversation around those and really try to get at what I'll call societal issues, institutional issues, and then individual issues regarding health inequity, disparities, racism, and maybe try to teach our audience about some of the terminology that is important to understand. Phrases like anti-racism, what does that mean? And what should that mean for us as individuals? So let me stop, and maybe I'll ask the intro question. How'd you get interested in this intersection of racism, health inequity, and medicine?
Yeah, going to the foundation and how this all started. Again, thanks for having me, Bob. And I'm really glad that we're going to be focusing our conversation on this important topic. The way that this journey started for me is, as you mentioned, I grew up in Southern California. I spent my early childhood in Compton, California, and I was raised by an amazing woman, Ty Harps, who raised me as a single parent, but had a lot of support from my amazing family. And my mom was the first in our family to both get her bachelor's and her master's degree. So it was really seeing her work hard and really put such an emphasis on education that made me want to do the same. And that was despite the fact that I had no one in my immediate family who was in medicine or the allied health fields. But for me, when I started to develop this love of medicine and science, it was in the third grade when I won the science fair at Amber Elementary School. And from that point forward, I really was just into this idea of becoming a physician. And my family just kind of believed in that dream and they supported me in wanting to do that. But when I first started to understand differences is when my family moved from Compton, California, when I was 10, and we moved to Rancho Cucamonga, which is a predominantly white suburb about an hour out from Compton in LA. And when I went to Rancho Cucamonga, I was suddenly the only Black girl in my class. Suddenly there was a Trader Joe's, which I had never seen before in my life. There were no longer potholes in the streets on my way to school. And I was definitely seeing how there was a differential access to food, differential access to a healthy living. And that difference is when I started to kind of think about why do those things exist? So after then, I also started to pay more attention to how a lot of my family members were unfortunately losing their lives to preventable diseases. My stepfather, when I was 15 years old, died from preventable heart disease. And when I went on to college and learned about public health and the social determinants of health, it kind of brought everything full circle because it was the differences that I saw growing up and then seeing my family members be impacted by preventable disease. I then realized that there's more to the picture that can't be solved just by looking at the science behind medicine. And you mentioned a bit about my first gap year in Spain when I was working with Spanish youth. But for my second gap year, I was actually in Chicago doing a year of service with AmeriCorps. And I was a health educator at a federally qualified health center there, known as Heartland Health Centers. And when I was there, I lived on the south side of Chicago, but I worked on the north side. And every day when I would come home from work from the north to the south side, it was about an hour train ride. I would notice that at the Roosevelt stop, my folks from Chicago might be able to relate to this, but I would notice that all of the white folks would get off the train. And as we continued into the south side, everyone would be Black and Latinx. And similar to the Compton versus Rancho Cucamonga, I saw those differences between the communities. And I soon learned that the life expectancy drops about 20 years when you go from the north to the south side of Chicago. And that itself is a manifestation of the racism that I saw speaking to patients as a health educator. And all of this said, I think that there were just these examples of systemic racism in this intersection of health that kept coming up throughout my entire life that really culminated why I wanted to go into medicine and gave me that health equity lens as I entered my first year of medical school.
You know, you've just listed so many topics that I want to try to get into with you that, and you said it in a way that I think is going to really help our listeners think about how to frame their own learning and conversations on the topic. One of the things that really struck me that you said was that you began to learn as you moved to another community that was predominantly white from your younger childhood in Compton, was you looked at things like access to foods, access, I suspect, to healthy foods, fruits and vegetables, and this notion of food deserts. You also made reference to something that I often refer to, which is that your zip code is far more determinant of your health than your genetic code. And packed within that is something that the American Heart Association, for example, has been very interested in, which is how do we understand structural racism, which leads to things like food deserts, access to insufficient housing, et cetera. Let me even ask a more basic question. Explain to our audience what is meant when we say structural racism.
Absolutely. So, Bob, to answer this question, I go back to a mentor and scholar who many of us look up to, and that's Dr. Kamara Jones. And she is a phenomenal clinician and public health advocate who really helped us understand this idea of racism by breaking it down into three different categories. And the first is that we have structural racism that exists on a broad societal level. So when we think about structural racism, we have to think about the fact that in 1619, when enslaved people were brought to the colony in Virginia, those individuals' interface with health was to be healthy enough to continue to do forced labor. And how that is the first relationship that Black folks came to know medicine and its purpose in their everyday lives. So then from there, we can start to conceptualize all of the different ways that the medical institution has been directly complicit in racism in society. So when we think about Marion Sims and his operating on Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, who were three enslaved women that he predominantly operated on to figure out the cure for vesicular vaginal fistula. And then we think about Carl Linnaeus, who once again was a biologist, who had a direct role in creating different stereotypes that were associated with different skin colors and different personality types associated with those things that still continue to persist in our understanding of different groups. Then we think about Samuel Cartwright, who created this mental illness known as Drapetomania, which was used to describe when enslaved people wanted to escape slavery. So it was once again this idea that the medical institution wasn't these folks who didn't have a direct role or maybe had an auxiliary role in amplifying systemic racism, but actually pushed it forward. So when we think about racism on a systems level, it's how it's actually embedded in our everyday living. Who has access to jobs, who has access to healthcare, and how institutions play a direct role in helping further that. And then from when we go from the societal level, we can then start to think about the racism that occurs between individuals. And that's when we think about interpersonal forms of racism. So that's kind of when we have those biases and prejudice start to play out and how we might decide I'm going to go to the other side of the street if I see a Black person walking toward me, or when I see a person whose name is LaShyra versus Vanessa, something that I might be more familiar with, I'm going to look over their application. And there's so many different studies and statistics that we've seen that prove exactly that. And then after you think about it on an interpersonal level, then it's the individual level when you start to think about internalized racism. So if you are that person that lives on the South Side, you are that person who has an uncommon name, who gets passed over for interviews, you might start to think that you have inherently done something wrong to deserve to never have access to opportunities. So you start to internalize the way that society and the world has made you feel. And I think that that's kind of how you can think about racism. And it's important to be anti-racist because you have to take the action to actively fight against these systems. Because the author Eve Ewing, the way that she describes racism, it's almost as if you're winding up a wind-up toy and it just goes and operates on its own. Or she also describes it as a merry-go-round. You don't even realize that you're on the ride until you take the active effort to get off of it. So I think that when it comes to being an ally in fighting against these forms that I've expressed, you have to actively learn about it and make tangible actions to really push against it.
Yeah, that is really well described, and thank you for taking it from the different levels. And what I'll ask our readership, our listenership, whichever mode you're getting this podcast, is really take the time to look at the American College of Cardiology's documents on diversity, equity, inclusion work, and take the time to look at Keith Churchwell's paper on a call to action and structural racism and the social determinants of health as being important drivers of overall cardiovascular health. So please do take a look at those for our audience. A couple things I want to try to unpack further. That you wrote this really terrific piece in the New England Journal, how I think you used the phrase medical education when missing the bullseye. And you gave a couple of examples, if I remember correctly, one of which is that both in your CPR training and in your dermatology class looking at Lyme disease, or maybe it was a Lyme disease class looking at skin manifestation of the disease. You make two really important points. One of which is that, like, am I only going to do CPR on white men? Because that's when I look at the manicures
Right.
that makes you think about, and what about the woman who's pregnant? And I go, wow, that's like such a straightforward thing to, why don't we ask ourselves that? And then the other was when the professor was showing pictures of Lyme disease, and did not necessarily spend a lot of time in trying to figure out, looking at that punctate in the surrounding ring of Lyme might be easier in white skin than it is in black skin. And so can we see some examples? So do you want to comment on that paper, which again, please do take a look at it for our listenership here. We'll make the link available on the site.
Absolutely, Bob. As I said earlier, when I came into medical school, I had this health equity lens, because it was all of these life experiences that I had that really helped me conceptualize and understand the importance of always thinking about who wasn't being represented, who was not in rooms, and what I could do to make sure that I was bringing the struggles and the experiences of my community and the people that I cared about into a space like Harvard Medical School. So when we were in class, for example, learning about Borrelia burgdorferi and Lyme disease and being in the Northeast and how important it was for us to know how to recognize that bullseye rash. And my classmate raised his hand and said, as a Black man, I would like to know, how would I recognize this in someone whose skin looked like mine? And the professor didn't know how to answer that question in a very thoughtful way. That really kind of ticked me off to say, wow, when we don't have equitable representation of skin tone in medical education, that has a direct implication on the care we're able to provide patients of diverse backgrounds. And I think that paper was really this call to action to say, if we're going to say that we're anti-racist, if we're going to say that we care about all patients and graduating physicians and clinicians who are really committed to that work, then we need to make sure that we're having exposure to this material. And I think that was like the first time that I was able to draw this line between such a clear example of how when we don't have equitable representation, it leads to worse patient outcomes. Because in that paper, I talk about how Black patients are less likely to be diagnosed with early stage Lyme disease because of the fact we are, and the authors think it's likely because of the fact that we're not learning how to recognize it earlier on in patients with darker skin tones. And we know that the thing about Lyme disease is that if you don't catch it early, it can become early disseminated and it becomes late stage. And then you have neurological and cardiac manifestations. So I think that is a perfect example of what happens when we don't catch something early. And it also, for me in that piece, was about intersectionality, which is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And it's about when you have intersecting marginalized identities. For example, if you are a Black person, but you're also a woman, and you also have a disability, and you also are lesbian, all of those things come together to make it such that you have a difficult experience traversing and finding a way to get through life because of the way that society makes you feel and blocks you from opportunities. So when I thought about the CPR piece, it made me think about how if you are both Black and not being able to get your Lyme disease recognized, but then you're also a woman, then that means that someone might be less likely to complete CPR for you because of the nervousness that they have around not getting that training and practice. So all these things kind of come full circle. And I think it's a perfect example of how it can manifest in medical education.
Yeah, I thought it was a really terrific piece. And it reminds me of conversations that I've talked in many settings with my colleague, Dr. Michelle Albert, who's at UCSF and is the incoming president of the American Heart Association. And Dr. Albert talks a lot about the intersectionality of particularly being Black and being a woman, and how those things in many cases are not just additive, but are more than additive, or really accelerate some of the health inequities and some of the way that care is delivered. And I thought the Lyme disease one was really perfect, because if you just look at sort of the end game and say, oh, why is it that Black people have worse outcomes than white people with Lyme? Well, you have to go to the beginning and like, how are the people that make the diagnosis being taught? Fabulous example. And I suspect we could banter back and forth on this one and find many, many examples. I thought your other one was about the Band-Aids and how come
Yeah,
Band-Aids aren't, my skin color? And it's like, these are just things, again, it's built into the system. And that's why it's so devastating, because it's built into the system. I know we're coming to the end of our time, and I'm going to go off script here. That's something that I didn't prepare you for. But as I'm looking at you, given you're doing this interview here, I see a photograph of a woman. It looks like an older picture over your shoulder. I suspect that's somebody that our audience should know about. Can you tell us about her?
Yes, absolutely. So the woman in this photo up here is Ida B. Wells, and she was a anti-lynching activist. And she was doing work in the South and was just really documenting all of the forms of lynching that was happening there. And then she moved up out in Chicago and did work there as well. And I think that what was amazing about Ida B. Wells is that she was very much so committed to documenting the truth and sharing the truth. And she often had to risk her life to do that, where her printing press was burned down and often got a lot of threats, but she was committed to doing the work. And I think that I'm still learning so much about her, but for me, she's just this beacon of reason and someone who I really hope to strive to be more like every day. And that's why I have her picture up there, because she reminds me to stay committed to my purpose.
Well, thank you for answering, particularly since I didn't give you a heads up earlier.
Absolutely.
But it's been catching my attention, and thank you for sharing it. She sounds like a remarkable woman that could serve as a beacon and a role model for all of us as we try to make society, make medicine, make cardiovascular medicine a better place. Lash, thank you for sharing your time with us. I know how busy you are, and I appreciate your willingness to share your views, your thoughts, your perspectives with our audience here on Medscape Cardiology. Again, my guest today has been LaShyra Nolen. Lash is a rising fourth-year medical student at Harvard Medical School, and the class president of her class at Harvard Medical School, the first Black female to hold that position. So, Lash, it's really been a pleasure for us here on Medscape Cardiology and theheart.org. And good luck, and remember to keep Stanford in mind when you're applying to residency programs, because we would be a better place with your talents here. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's been a pleasure.